When German women prisoners crossed into Iowa by train after midnight, they had been told America was weak, a soft, divided nation that would never endure a long war. Their officers had mocked American factories, American soldiers, and American women. But something they saw through the train windows that night began to disturb them in a way no guard ever had. What could possibly be so unsettling about ordinary lights shining across the dark countryside? And why did this single train ride start to crack everything they had been taught about the enemy? They saw farmhouse after farmhouse shining in the dark. A lamp in a kitchen window. A bulb above a barn door. A porch light left burning beside an empty road. Then another. Then another. Whole towns passing in yellow rows. Grain elevators marked by red warning lamps. Gas stations glowing beside highways. Stores closed for the night, but still lit behind glass. A white church with a single light over the steps. In Germany, darkness had become obedience. Here, even the countryside shone. No American guard explained it. No officer stood in the aisle to persuade them. America did not argue with the lie. It simply turned on the lights. There were 76 German women in the train car. Some had served as clerks, nurses, switchboard operators, canteen workers, and communications assistants. A few had been captured years earlier in North Africa, attached to field hospitals and administrative units that collapsed with the German armies there. Others had been taken later in Italy, France, or Germany itself, then moved through camps and transport systems until the war finally placed them on American soil. They were not soldiers in the way men liked to define soldiers, but they had worn the system's uniform. They had typed its messages, counted its supplies, treated its wounded, repeated its slogans, and survived inside its machinery long enough to be captured with it. Now they were prisoners of the United States. They had expected cattle cars. They did not get cattle cars. The seats were padded. The windows opened. There were curtains, though some were faded. At the end of the car stood a metal water cooler with paper cups. The American guards carried rifles, but they moved without theatrical cruelty. That confused the women more than threats would have. One of the prisoners had been a schoolteacher before the war, before shortages in politics and uniforms reached into every ordinary room. She had hidden a pencil stub inside the seam of her coat and kept notes in the margins of an old prayer booklet. That night, as the train rolled through the American Midwest, she wrote one sentence by moonlight. "They have electricity in the barns." She stared at the sentence afterward. It looked childish. It also looked like the beginning of defeat. The women had arrived in America prepared to find decay. Some expected mobs. Some expected hunger. Some expected American civilians to line the tracks and scream at them. Some expected revenge arranged neatly under the name of justice. Instead, at the port, they had been counted, examined, photographed, given identification cards, fed hot food, and told the rules in careful German. One woman with a fever had been taken to an infirmary and returned with clean sheets, medicine, and a nurse who checked her temperature every 4 hours. "They treated me," she whispered when she came back. "Because they need us fit for work," another woman said. But the explanation felt too small. The first meal aboard the train had been stew, white bread, canned peaches, and coffee. Real coffee. The women ate in silence, too proud to show hunger and too hungry to preserve pride. One guard, a young corporal from Ohio, noticed a woman staring at the bread. "There's more," he said. She looked up. "More?" He pointed toward the serving cart. "Bread. Take another piece." The woman did not move. The corporal seemed to misunderstand her hesitation. "Take two, then." "Kitchen packed too much." The words traveled through the car slowly. "Packed too much." No one laughed. By the time the train reached Iowa, the women had stopped speaking loudly. The car was filled instead with the steady sound of wheels over track and the small shifting of people whose beliefs no longer sat comfortably inside them. Near dawn, they passed a factory town. Smoke rose from stacks. Electric lights burned inside long brick buildings. Cars filled the parking lots even before sunrise. Workers walked through the gates carrying lunch pails. Women walked among them. Not a few women at desks. Women in work clothes. Women with scarves tied over their hair. Women moving with the brisk certainty of people expected by machines. One of the German prisoners stared. "They work in the factories?" An older woman beside her answered, "You have eyes." But like that, through the window, the American women disappeared through the factory doors without ceremony. The schoolteacher wrote later, "In Germany, They told us American women were vain and useless. Here they enter factories before sunrise while their husbands and sons fight overseas. At 6 in the morning, the train stopped beside a small station to take on water. The women were ordered to remain seated, but the windows were open and nothing prevented them from looking. The town was awake. A man swept the platform. 2 boys delivered newspapers from canvas bags. A woman unlocked the door of a diner and turned the sign from closed to open. A milk truck rattled past. Across the street, a hardware store window displayed tools, lanterns, nails, rope, work gloves, buckets, paint, and a red bicycle. The bicycle held their attention. It sat in the window like an insult. Not because it was beautiful, because it was ordinary. In Germany, rubber had become precious, metal had become war, and childhood had been postponed until victory. Here, a bicycle waited behind glass for someone's daughter or son. One of the guards stepped onto the platform and returned 10 minutes later with a crate. Inside were apples. He moved down the aisle, handing them out one by one. A prisoner looked at the apple in her hand. "What is this for?" The guard shrugged. "Farmer's wife brought them. Said women on a train get hungry. We are prisoners." I expect she knew that. The apple was red, firm, cold from the morning. The schoolteacher held hers for a long time before biting into it. Juice ran down her thumb. She wrote nothing then. Some discoveries could not be recorded while they were still in the mouth. By afternoon, the train reached the prison camp. It stood beyond a town of low houses, grain silos, and a white water tower painted with blue letters. The camp had fences, watchtowers, barracks, rules, inspections, and roll calls. It was not freedom, and no one mistook it for freedom. But the barracks had electric lights. The latrines had running water. The showers were hot. The infirmary had clean sheets, glass bottles of medicine, metal instruments arranged in order, and nurses who looked tired rather than hateful. The women were assigned bunks. They were issued blankets. They were told when meals would be served, when letters could be written, when work details would begin, what wages would be credited, and what punishments applied to violations. The rules were strict. That was expected. What unsettled them was that the rules seemed to apply to the Americans too. That evening, an American private cursed at a prisoner for stepping out of line. A sergeant corrected him in front of everyone. "Orders are enough," the sergeant said. "You don't need to add filth." The private reddened. The German women said nothing, but they remembered. The next morning, breakfast was oatmeal, eggs, toast, and milk. Milk. Several women stared at the cups. One whispered, "For prisoners?" Another answered, "For Americans, perhaps this is prison food." That idea passed between them like a draft under a door. During the first week, they were sent to work on farms. The labor was not easy. Iowa in harvest season did not care who had won or lost a war. Apples had to be gathered, potatoes sorted, chickens fed, laundry scrubbed, corn shocks tied, jars carried into cellars, hay stacked under cover before rain. The women worked under guard, but often beside American farm wives whose sons were overseas. This should have produced hatred. Sometimes it did. One woman would not speak to them except by pointing. Another watched them with eyes so hard the prisoners avoided looking back. But others surprised them. An old farm wife with a stiff knee showed them how to sort potatoes properly and scolded their first attempt with such agricultural disappointment that several prisoners nearly smiled. A younger woman in a blue dress brought water to the field and handed the cup first to a German girl who looked near fainting. The girl did not take it. The American held it out until she did. "My husband is in France," the woman said. The girl lowered her eyes. "I am sorry." The American looked over the field. "So am I. Drink." That was all. No forgiveness. No friendship. No speech. Only water, given because the day was hot and a woman was thirsty. The schoolteacher began recording small facts more carefully than large ones. American farm wife gave water to prisoner before drinking herself. Farmer owns 2 tractors. Barn has electric milking machine. Children ride school bus every morning. Coffee served at noon. No one locks the pantry during our work detail. That last fact disturbed the women for days. On a farm outside a town whose name none of them could pronounce, the prisoners ate lunch at a long table under a maple tree. They expected guards to serve them from tins. Instead, the farmer's wife and her daughters brought baskets. Fried chicken, potatoes, bread, pickles, sliced tomatoes, apple pie. The prisoners waited for the Americans to eat first. The farmer wiped his hands on a towel. "Food's there," he said. "Eat before flies get it." One of the older German women answered stiffly, "We are not accustomed to eating with civilians." The farmer looked at her. "You accustomed to being hungry?" No one answered. "Then try this instead." They ate. The fried chicken became a subject of private discussion for 3 nights. Not because it was the finest thing any of them had tasted, though to some it nearly was, but because there had been enough. Enough for prisoners. Enough for guards. Enough for the farmer's family. Enough that the farmer's daughter wrapped leftovers in wax paper and sent them back with the work truck. One prisoner said later, "They are showing off." Another said, "A person cannot show off leftovers." The schoolteacher wrote, "Their abundance is not theatrical. That is what makes it terrible. They do not prepare it for us. We are simply allowed to see what was already there." In the second month, a work detail was sent near a factory. It produced agricultural equipment, not weapons. That was what the guards said, and perhaps it was true. The prisoners were assigned to unload crates, sweep storage sheds, and sort packing material, work permitted under the regulations. Still, from where they labored, they could see inside the main building. Conveyor belts moved parts from station to station. Electric drills whined. Women checked gauges. Old men drove forklifts. A boy who could not have been more than 17 operated a machine press with casual authority. Overhead, cranes moved steel as if it weighed no more than cloth. The German women watched too long and were told twice to keep working. One of them had worked before the war in a machine office near Essen. That evening, in the barracks, she sat on her bunk and rubbed her hands together. "They are not better with their hands," she said. No one replied. She looked up. "That is not the point. Their machines carry the work. Their system carries the machines. Their roads, their power, their parts, their schedules. Even when one person is ordinary, the whole country is arranged to produce." This was worse than admiration. It was diagnosis. Another prisoner muttered, "Germany still had better discipline." The woman from Essen looked at her. Discipline did not keep our cities standing. No one contradicted her. By winter, the camp had changed. Not outwardly. The fences remained. The guards remained. Roll call came in the cold. Women still complained about the food when pride required it, then cleaned their plates. But the arguments changed. At first, the loudest women had spoken of secret weapons, final victories, betrayal, sacrifice, destiny, and the supposed weakness of democratic countries. Now they spoke of tractors, of electric lines, of wages, of whether American workers truly owned their own cars, of how much land one family could farm with machines, of whether German towns could ever be rebuilt with such methods. The fanatics did not disappear. They gathered in corners, sharper and more bitter than before. They said American comfort was poison. They said democracy made people vulgar. They said Germany had lost only because others had outnumbered her. But fewer women listened. It is difficult to praise hardship after tasting butter. Christmas came cold and bright. The prisoners expected nothing. Some were glad of that. Holidays were dangerous because they carried memory. On Christmas Eve, the camp commandant permitted a local church choir to sing outside the recreation hall. The prisoners were marched in under guard and seated on benches. The choir was mostly women, old men, and children. They sang Silent Night in German, bad German, soft German, German shaped by American mouths, and Iowa winters. At first, several prisoners looked down in embarrassment for them. Then the song reached the second verse. A woman in the front row began to cry. She covered her face at once, angry with herself, but the sound had already escaped. No one mocked her. The children continued singing. Afterward, packages were distributed. Not lavish ones. Cigarettes, soap, toothpaste, candy, socks knitted by women who had never met them, small books for those who wanted them. One prisoner held a pair of gray socks in her lap, as if they might vanish. "My brother froze outside Moscow," she said. A guard standing nearby heard her. After a moment, he said quietly, "My brother's on a ship in the Pacific." The prisoner looked at him. "Then why give us these?" The guard glanced toward the choir gathering their coats. "Wasn't me. Church ladies did it." "Why?" He buttoned his jacket. "They said Christmas doesn't stop at the fence." The schoolteacher wrote that night until the pencil nearly tore the paper. That night, as the American children sang Silent Night in broken German inside the prison camp, something quiet but powerful happened. Several of the women, who had spent months behind barbed wire expecting only coldness from their enemies, felt something inside them loosen for the first time. But what did they carry with them after that night? What stayed with these prisoners long after the war ended? Through hunger, ruined cities, and the long years of rebuilding. Because ordinary people on the other side of the fence had chosen not to let hatred have the final word. If you're watching this from somewhere in the United States right now, I'd really like to know which city and state you're in. Leave it in the comments below. And if this story is resonating with you, leave a like and subscribe. Really helps the channel grow. A nation that can feed enemies, clothe enemies, heal enemies, and still build ships must not be mistaken for weak. Mercy from the powerless is pleading. Mercy from the strong is judgment. In the camp library, the women discovered something that disturbed them almost as much as the food. Newspapers. Not old newspapers selected to flatter America. Current newspapers. They criticized officials by name. They argued about taxes, military decisions, farm prices, rationing, elections, shortages, labor disputes, and the conduct of public men. Columnists disagreed with one another in print. Citizens wrote letters scolding leaders in language that would have brought police to a German door. The prisoners waited for someone to remove the papers. No one did. One former clerk tapped a headline criticizing a senator. They permit this? An American camp clerk looked up from his desk. Permit what? To criticize leaders. The clerk seemed genuinely confused. That's half the point of having leaders. The women stared at him. He went back to his paperwork. Later that week, 2 American guards argued near the supply office about a speech by the president. One admired it. The other thought it foolish. Neither lowered his voice. Neither looked over his shoulder. Neither seemed afraid that disagreement itself was dangerous. The schoolteacher wrote, "They do not worship their leaders. They hire them, blame them, replace them, and continue eating breakfast." This, more than the factories, frightened some of the prisoners. Because it meant American order did not need fear to survive. Their trains ran. Their factories worked. Their farms produced. Their guards followed rules. Their newspapers criticized authority. Their citizens argued openly. Their institutions continued. No portrait had to be treated like an altar. No slogan had to end every conversation. No single man had to be made larger than the country. The Americans were not perfect. The prisoners could see that much. Americans complained constantly about weather, prices, officers, politicians, machinery, coffee, roads, paperwork, and one another. But the complaints did not weaken the country. Somehow, they belonged to its strength. A people who could correct errors in public did not need to pretend that mistakes were victories. In spring, the photographs came. At first, they arrived as rumors. Camps liberated in Germany. Bodies. Mass graves. Barbed wire not for soldiers, but for civilians. Names whispered, denied, repeated. Many prisoners refused to believe it. They said it was enemy propaganda. They said photographs could be staged. They said no German government, whatever its severity, would do such things. Then the camp authorities showed the images. No one was forced to look, but nearly everyone did. The room was silent except for breathing. The photographs were placed on tables beneath electric lights. American officers stood back. They did not shout. They did not accuse each woman by name. They let the pictures do what pictures do when words have become too cowardly. A few prisoners cursed. One fainted. One insisted it was false until a guard quietly pointed to a sign in the background written in German. The schoolteacher looked at the faces in the photographs and felt something inside her collapse that had not collapsed at surrender, not on the ship, not under the Iowa lights, not even at the Christmas hymn. She had known enough to be guilty of not asking. That was the sentence she could not escape. That evening, no one in her barracks spoke of secret weapons. No one spoke of destiny. A woman who had once been proud of her party pin took it from inside her sewing kit and threw it into the stove. Another said, "We did not know." The woman from Essen answered, "We knew not to know." No one contradicted her. After that, America became harder for them to understand, not easier. If the Americans had treated them brutally, the world would have made a cruel kind of sense. If the guards had beaten them, if the farmers had starved them, if the doctors had refused them, the prisoners could have folded everything back into the old story. Enemies were enemies. Power was power. Victory meant revenge. But the Americans had done something more devastating. They had won and then remained orderly. They had won and continued following rules. They had won and fed prisoners. They had won and allowed newspapers to scold their own authorities. They had won and still expected a guard to speak to a prisoner without filth. The women had been taught that mercy was weakness. America made mercy look like discipline. After enough time had passed, the prisoners knew they would eventually be sent home. Home had become a complicated word. The Germany they had left no longer existed. Cities were broken. Families were scattered. Letters arrived with news that made women sit on their bunks for hours without removing their shoes. A mother missing. A husband dead. A child evacuated and not yet found. A sister living in one room with 3 families. The Americans began offering classes. English, agriculture, bookkeeping, mechanics, civics, nutrition, sanitation, democratic government. At first, many attended because there was little else to do. Then they attended because the lessons had use. A woman from Bavaria filled pages with notes on crop storage. A former nurse copied diagrams of American hospital supply systems. A clerk studied election procedures with the severe attention she once gave military forms. The schoolteacher was asked to help translate. She accepted. Not because she had become American. She had not. Not because she had forgiven herself. She had not done that either. She translated because the future would need accurate words. On the last week before repatriation, a group of women was sent once more to help with harvest cleanup on an Iowa farm. The farm belonged to the same family that had once fed them fried chicken beneath the maple tree. The farmer's oldest son had not returned from Europe. Everyone knew it. No one mentioned it. At noon, his wife set food under the tree. The meal was simpler than before. Bread, beans, potatoes, coffee, apple slices. The prisoners ate with the solemn care of people who understood the table differently now. When the work was finished, the farmer walked with them to the truck. He shook hands with the American guard first. Then, unexpectedly, his wife stepped forward and offered her hand to the German women. Some hesitated. The woman from Essen took it. The farmer's wife gripped hard. "Build something better when you get back," she said. The woman from Essen looked at her. "We will try." The farmer's wife nodded. Trying is where decent things start. The schoolteacher wrote the sentence down before the truck reached camp. Years later, she would remember that woman more clearly than most officers she had obeyed. When repatriation finally came, the prisoners crossed the Atlantic in the opposite direction. The ship that carried them back to Europe smelled of salt, fuel, wet wool, and uncertainty. The women stood at the rail, watching America disappear into haze. No one cheered. No one sang. Some were relieved. Some were afraid. Some had addresses folded in their pockets from farm wives, guards, church women, teachers, pastors, and children who had asked them to write when Germany had mail again. The schoolteacher carried her prayer book diary inside her coat. Its pages were crowded now. Electricity in barns. Real coffee. Women in factories. Farmer's wife gave water. No locked pantry. Christmas does not stop at the fence. They criticize leaders and are not arrested. We knew not to know. Build something better. When Germany appeared, it did not look like the country they had left. It looked smaller, not only because it was ruined, because the lie had been larger than the land itself. The women returned to towns without roofs, schools without glass, churches without bells, factories without machines, kitchens without enough bread. They returned to families who wanted food before explanations, and to children who had learned not to trust uniforms. Some former prisoners said little about America. Some spoke too much. Some were mocked for admiring the enemy. Some were told they had been softened. But when a town needed records rebuilt, the women who had seen American filing systems remembered how order could serve people instead of hiding crimes. When a school needed to reopen, the former teacher said, "Open it before the offices." Children must learn before officials multiply. When a clinic had to divide medicine, the former nurse remembered the American infirmary where even prisoners had received clean bandages. When old bitterness demanded that Germany rise again through anger, another woman said, "Anger built the last ruins. Try something else." Not all listened. Enough did. The schoolteacher eventually returned to a classroom with cracked walls and a stove that smoked in winter. She taught children whose fathers had not come home and whose mothers counted potatoes with the seriousness of bankers. On the first week, a boy asked whether America was truly as rich as people said. The teacher looked toward the window. Outside, the town was still gray with dust. "Yes," she said. The children stirred. Do they have cities of gold? Another asked. No. Do they eat meat every day? Some do. Do all of them have cars? No. The children looked disappointed. The teacher rested her hand on the desk. The thing to understand is not that Americans have everything. They do not. The thing to understand is that they built a country where ordinary people expect tomorrow to work. The children were too young to understand that fully. So she told them about a train crossing Iowa at night, about barns with electric lights, about women walking into factories before sunrise, about an apple handed through a train window, about a farmer's wife who had lost a son and still fed enemy prisoners under a maple tree, about newspapers that criticized leaders and remained on the table, about guards who disagreed openly and did not whisper, about a Christmas song sung badly in German by American children who owed them nothing. The room grew quiet. A girl in the front row raised her hand. Were they better than us? The teacher thought of the photographs, the camps, the silence in the barracks, the party pin burning in the stove, the Iowa farmhouse lights, the farmer's wife saying, "Build something better." No, she said at last. They were not born better. She looked at the children, at their thin faces and sharpened eyes. They had chosen better things to build. That was the lesson she kept teaching. Not worship of another country, not hatred of her own, but the knowledge that a nation could be judged by what it made possible for ordinary people, by how it behaved when it held power over enemies, and by whether its citizens were free enough to correct errors without fearing the knock at the door. In time, Germany changed. Not all at once. No country does. Roofs were repaired. Windows replaced. Schools reopened. Farms produced again. Factories learned new methods. Elections returned. Newspapers argued. Children who had grown up among rubble learned words their parents had once forgotten how to trust. Freedom. Responsibility. Law. Decency. The former prisoners carried America inside their memories in strange fragments. A water cooler on a train. White bread. Hot showers. A red bicycle in a hardware store window. A church choir singing in poor German. A newspaper criticizing a public official without disappearing by morning. A guard correcting another guard because orders did not require cruelty. A farmer's wife saying, "Build something better." Many years later, when the schoolteacher was an old woman, a letter arrived from Iowa. It came from the daughter of the farmer beneath the maple tree. She had been a young woman during the war and had remembered the German prisoners eating at her mother's table. The letter was short. "My mother used to wonder whether any of you went home and did as she asked. She hoped some of you built something better. I thought you might like to know we still farm the same land. The maple tree is gone now, but her table is still in the house." The old teacher read the letter twice. Then she opened the drawer where she kept the prayer book diary. The pencil marks had faded, but the first sentence was still legible. "They have electricity in the barns." She smiled at that. A frightened prisoner had written it as evidence of wealth. An old woman understood it as evidence of something larger. A free country had lit not only its cities, but its farms. It had fed not only its soldiers, but its prisoners. It had armed itself without starving its children. It had built factories without silencing argument. It had buried sons and still handed apples to enemies on trains. That was the force the prisoners had not been prepared to meet. Not merely American steel, not merely American food, not merely American machines, but American confidence. The confidence of a people strong enough to keep the lights on, strong enough to produce more than war consumed, strong enough to respect rules after victory, and, at their best, strong enough to show mercy without asking permission from hatred. The German women had arrived expecting to see a broken nation. Instead, from a train window in Iowa, they saw farmhouse lights stretching across the dark. And for many of them, that was the moment the old lie began to die.